Hello everybody, my name is Hollis, and I am going to be talking to you about doorway spells, specifically one doorway spell. We're going to be doing about 45 minutes of this pre-recorded, and then towards the end of this, around 3:45-ish, once the video should be wrapped up, I'm going to be hopping onto a live sort of thing in order to answer questions that you might have. Hopefully, I'll be able to cover this well enough that you're not going to have a lot of questions, but I imagine that there will be some. So this particular doorway spell, as you might have noticed, I'm currently not sitting in a doorway. And the reason for that is that I feel like I need to explain a bit about this before we can really get into this. Specifically in that the spell that I'm going to be doing today, that I'm going to be walking you through, is a part of Romani magic. And Romani magic in general is a closed practice. So what a closed practice is that it usually means that people that aren't part of the original culture surrounding that magic aren't necessarily a part of it. So this happens a lot also in voodoo and some Native American practices. A lot of times it's that people inside that practice will choose to either open it to teach it to other people, or it remains closed and only people of that culture can really identify with it and be able to practice it. Most people who have known me for a moderate amount of time to a long time know that in the past I've talked about Romani magic, and I've also talked about it being a closed practice, and I've been very adamant about I'm not going to teach it. I've closed it off and I don't really want to talk to people about it. That attitude of mine has sort of changed over the course of this past year during COVID-19. Part of it is that I was talking to some of my cousins over the summer and over the spring. And what I found out is that, so there are about 3 of us that know a moderate amount of the sort of like magical practice and sort of like the folklore and folk practices that my great-grandmother and their grandmother taught them. And the problem is that when we talk to each other, we realize I had a moderate amount of, if it was puzzle pieces, I have a large number of pieces. One of my cousins has a moderate amount of pieces, and my third cousin has maybe like 5 or 6 pieces to the puzzle. And we found out that even if we combined all of these pieces together and even talking about practice, there were still some things that my grandmother had neglected to teach any of us, or taught my dad, who was also one of the people that she sort of talked to. That meant that a lot of the practices that she had been carrying on both as like an oral tradition and as a tradition that was passed on from her parents to her had sort of been lost when she passed away. And I came to the realization that over time, especially given kind of the issues that Romani are facing in the world now, and sort of just like the issues that our world in general is facing, we needed to be able to like talk more about these practices, and I want to be able to kind of pass along this practice so that way it doesn't die. But I want to stress, even in passing on this practice, that Romani culture is not a monolith, not at all. So you have lots of Romani culture that's spread out through the diaspora. That's very, very different. If you sat one Romani person next to another Romani person, it's very, very plausible that they would not have the same belief system at all. In certain parts of the world, like especially in the Middle East, there's a lot of Romani that are practicing Muslims. In Central Europe, you have a lot of Romani that are Catholic, and then in Eastern Europe, you have a lot of Romani that are Eastern Orthodox, and even in England and Ireland, you have Romani that are more like Protestant. And so you kind of, even in general, our culture can't really seem to agree on a certain thing. Like there are a lot of times, like even Romani as a language isn't necessarily centralized, and there's a lot of different dialects, and like a Romani person from Germany might not be able to understand a Romani person from like Romania. And so this also applies to magical practice as well. Very few Romani would actually consider themselves pagan. This is similar kind of to when Byron Ballard talks about Appalachian folk magic and the sort of like granny witches of Appalachia that were necessarily like practicing Christians and believed in Christianity, but still did a lot of like folklore and folk practice in like the 1970s, 1980s, like going on previously to that even. So a lot of us will do sort of like stuff pertaining to superstition and stuff pertaining to practicing magic, but very few of us actually consider ourselves to be pagan, and even in that sort of like group, very few also don't. A lot of us don't consider ourselves to be witches either. So I'm kind of singular in that sort of practice, and that doesn't really come from me being Romani so much as it comes from other experiences that I've had in my life. So that being said, the spell that I'm going to teach you is something that was passed down from my grandmother, or my great-grandmother, was passed down to me, and in me passing it to you, it's sort of evolving in magical practice. And that's something that also has happened in Romani magic over the years, is that our practices evolve based on where we're at, who we're interacting with, what sort of things we need to do in order to survive in the environment that we're in. Like a lot of protection spells that we have might be based on like whether or not we need to move around, whether or not we're settling kind of like into one area, kind of who we're protecting ourselves from or what we're protecting ourselves from. But I'll get into that a little bit more later when I start talking about the items that were mentioned for you to gather before the spell, and kind of talk about like the significance of each item individually before we really get into it. But just know that like the spell that I'm about to teach you, while it is Romani magic, doesn't necessarily mean that it is a specific practice that all Romani do, and every Romani person that you talk to is going to know how to do it. So now we're going to talk about doorways in Romani culture and magic. So the biggest thing to kind of get into here is the difference between protecting people versus protecting space. So especially during the time when Romani people were much more nomadic than they could be now, with the closing of borders in Europe and kind of the assimilation that has been sort of like forced upon people in order to tell them that they basically have to settle. If you were protecting people, then a lot of times your people were very far-flung, widespread. They weren't really around. Men were going out of camp to go work. Women were staying more in camp to do sort of like the household, sort of like watching camp and doing that sort of thing. And the biggest thing is that if you were protecting people, it made much more sense to just give people like wards and give people jewelry and give people like sort of significant items they could carry with them, or put sort of like protective charms like on their clothes or that sort of thing, in order to like protect them wherever they're going. So in terms of protecting a doorway, that comes down to protecting space. And a lot of times people, when they think about protection, they think of protection of the self. They think about protection of, they think about like carrying protection with you so nothing bad happens to you. But it's also important to have a space where you can feel protected. And so you kind of have the ability to, and this is something that carries over a little bit into paganism today, where you protect a space, you protect your house. You move into a house and you sage it, so that way it's cleansed, so that way you get good energy from that place. You ward your house, so that way nothing, like no robbers come in, or like nobody brings harm to you or your family. That's a really similar sort of practice to Romani magic as well. So the other big thing about protecting space is that space is always moving. So it's always in flux, it's always changing. And so this isn't necessarily a one and done spell, like sort of like when, like I was talking about before, where you cleanse your house when you move in, where you burn something and you sort of like smoke your house so that way all of the negative energy goes away. This is a spell that is practiced regularly, not necessarily, sometimes at the turning of seasons, sometimes at the turning of the year, sometimes even if you're feeling particularly in flux, it can be very grounding in that it's something that you can do when your life is changing week to week in order to give you a little bit of stability. And so the protection of space also is the protection of things. And when you don't have a lot of things, and the things that you have need to be very, very practical, need to have at least 2 uses in order for them to be useful, and all of it's got to be packed up into a horse trailer sized wagon, then you need to be not necessarily covetous of your stuff, but you need to be protective of your stuff. And so that's also sort of a protection of space, is making sure that all of your items that are in the space that you're protecting are going to continue existing in their particular space, in their particular usefulness, and not end up with and not end up getting walked off with, or also not necessarily not getting stolen, but also just not having any bad energy attached to them. And this also shifted in practice quite a bit when Romani people went from moving around in Vardos and moving around in location to starting to settle into one home. So around the turn of the 1900s, you had a lot of people, especially during the Industrial Revolution, that were having a hard time crossing over borders, that were having a hard time finding a way to continue the traveling lifestyle in order to find work, in order to be able to move around in a way that was still protective to them. And so you had a lot of people settling. And when you settle into one home, suddenly your priorities become different. And then it becomes all right, well, I don't have to worry too much about keeping track of all of my things, because I'm allowed to have things that aren't necessarily entirely useful anymore. I can change out things that don't necessarily not to kind of bring some modern sort of idealism into it, the sort of idea of I can get rid of things that don't bring me joy, or spark joy. And you kind of had this different mindset of, okay, I don't have to protect the space, and I don't have to worry about the space traveling around with me and things being so changeable. So if that makes sense. If not, then ask me questions later and I'll be able to explain it a bit better. The biggest thing is that the doorway spell can basically be any doorway in your home. So it can be the doorway to your bedroom, it can be the doorway to your bathroom, it can be the doorway to your kitchen, it can be anywhere in your home. It can be your front door, it can be your back door. I've known some of my relations. One of my cousins will actually use some of it on her windows sometimes too, if she's feeling particularly worried about anybody coming through her windows. She has a very large window in her house that could open up, and theoretically somebody could come inside it. So she will put charms on that window as well. My father, when he did something similar to this, would use the doorway between our living room and our laundry room. And the way that our house was set up was that we had a living room, there was a small laundry room, and then beyond the laundry room was the bathroom. And he would always do the doorway between the living room and the laundry room. And that seems like a really weird place to put it. But the thing with my dad was that was actually at the center of our house. That doorway was smack dab in the center of our house. And his idea was that he wanted to push from this sort of liminal space. He wanted to push the sort of protection that he was having on all sides, so that way it sort of worked as a bubble and encompassed the house. And when I started doing this, when I started moving around, I started doing this when I was living in apartment buildings. I would do this on the front door of my apartment, because I didn't necessarily want to push all sides, but I wanted to push everything from like where the doorway was to into my apartment. So it also is important to recognize kind of where in your home you want to put this and how you want that energy to spread out. And that'll be important, especially during the doorway spell itself, especially when it comes to working with the chalk. And I'll be able to talk a bit more about that when we talk about using chalk and this sort of thing. So we're going to now get into the significance of the different items in this spell. So you want to gather your water, your salt, your rag, and your chalk now. So in Romani magic, as far as I have seen it, both from learning from my grandmother and learning from other people, other books about the subject, the biggest thing is that Romani magic relies very heavily on simple items that everybody has. So this is also similar to what Byron talks about in Appalachian folk magic, which, by the way, you should really read her book Stops in Ditchwater, because you'll get a very similar sort of like magical practice in Appalachian folk magic to what Romani people do, specifically in like using household items, using everyday stuff in order to complete magic. So the first thing that we want to talk about here is water. Specifically, what you're putting it in and how important it is. So, a little bit of history. Romani camps were generally put by rivers, usually moderately flowing to fast flowing rivers. And the thing is that when you're drawing water from a river, there's actually certain sections of the river that you are supposed to get certain sections of water from. So the idea is that water needs to be from a pure and clean source. So it's every person in the river or every part of the river was doing something different. So at the very mouth of the river, you've got where people are washing dishes. Dishes are really important in Romani culture, to the point that like we don't actually share dishes a lot of the time. Like everybody has a plate, a cup, a bowl, and a set of silverware, and like they're yours. And when you are a child, you learn how to wash all of your own dishes, and then nobody else touches your stuff. I learned that at a really young age, and thankfully I grew out of it, because otherwise festival meals would be very, very different for me. So upriver would be cleaning out dishes and taking care of things. The next part of it would be laundry and taking care of washing clothes, which men's clothes were put higher upriver than women's clothes. And then women's clothes were put higher upriver from the clothes of women who were pregnant or menstruating, which is a kind of interesting tidbit. And then children's clothes would be further downriver. Then you had like the bathing processes of Romani people. And this is where things get really interesting. Horses would be bathed before anybody else. Horses would be ran through the river further upstream than people were. And that's because horses were very, very important in Romani culture. If your horse got sick, then that was more of a problem to you as somebody who's running a camp than if a person got sick, which sounds terrible and kind of is, but like if you don't have a horse and your horse drops dead, you can't move anymore. So that kind of becomes important. And then you had men bathing, women bathing, and children bathing. And the interesting thing is that if you are drawing water for specifically magical purposes, your water comes from the end of this river. So after the dishes, the laundry, the horses, the men, the women, the children, the bathing, all that sort of thing, obviously it's not happening at the same time, but the section of river that you would be drawing your water from magic would come after all of that, specifically because you want water that is sort of like imbued with the essence of your life, of the people that are around you. You want water that is not necessarily, you're not using it for cooking, but you want it to be water that is, that sort of has the mana, if you will, of the people that you are helping to protect, of the things you are helping to protect. And then obviously like the receptacle that you're putting it in, after you are done, is going to be washed at the front of the river anyway. So you don't have to worry too much about, okay, I've gathered this water and now I can only ever use this pot for magic. That's not how that works. If you had like just a pot for magic, that would be very, very useless. So we have water. Set that down. All right. Then we have salt. Salt is used for everything. You use it to cure meat. You use it to cure hide. You use it in your food. You use it for a multitude of different things. And it's the best way to preserve food that we had for a very, very long time. I mean, if you look up any recipes in the 1930s to the 1940s, you're going to see why they boil everything, and suddenly it makes a lot more sense. But so everybody had salt, and salt was known to be able to like keep stuff out. It keeps bacteria out of food, so it keeps rot out of food. It keeps hides and tanning from like falling apart, that sort of thing. You salt a lot of things, and so it only makes sense in multiple cultures, including Romani culture, that you would put salt into things in order to purify them. So you do that for magic. You have a rag, kind of self-explanatory, but it's, again, not necessarily a rag that you would use only for magic. You'd use something that's like a cleaning rag, and then you would just launder it, and then you would wash it again. But the interesting thing about like the rag that you're using here is that this also means that you're not necessarily going to have like the same level of protection as you would when you're doing the doorway spell. But that also means if you're using this rag for other purpose, then there's sort of like a leftover, almost like a remnant of when you're washing something or if you're scrubbing something, and it sort of like imbues a little bit of protection into the thing that you are working with. So that's also a really interesting fun fact about that. Then we get to chalk. So chalk is the most, in my opinion, the most interesting part about the spell. A lot of people that I have seen, especially in the pagan community, when they are doing something with doorways or when they're doing something with runes, they have a tendency they'll use like ink or they will carve it into a place. This is all well and good, except that eventually you might want to leave this place, or eventually you might want to re-up the thing that you are doing. And so chalk is really interesting because it allows you to write on a surface and then wipe that away. And so like if you're re-upping a spell, or if you are redoing a spell, or even if you are just changing a spell in general, let's say that I want to change sort of the other components to the spell that I'm doing. You want to be able to just wipe the first one away and start over from scratch. And this is especially important when you are like riding around in a Vardo. And I'm going to have Bob in this portion, thank you Bob, put up a couple pictures of Vardos. Vardos are very well ornamented. They are very detailed in their carving, and you don't really want to damage that kind of beauty with that sort of like carving something a little more crass into the doorway of your home. So it's really important, thank you again, Bob, for you to be able to take this sort of writing away and sort of just like wipe it away. And it's also really good for another purpose, and I feel like a lot of college age in the closet pagans are going to understand this. Let's say that you're a Romani person that's camping out on the edge of a town, and the townspeople are having a lot of bad luck recently. And so what they decide to do is that they want to check your camp to see if there are any witches living there. All of a sudden, you got to make sure that like the pot that you, and again, this is why it's really nice to use household items, the pot that you would use to put the rag in and do all the magic just goes with the cooking pots. The rag that you use for cleaning goes with the cleaning rags. The salt goes back on the shelf. And the doorway that you have chalked with your magic spell gets wiped away, and nobody is the wiser that you might have enchanted it. And then once the people have gone, they see that there's no witches there, and they go on their merry way. That's when you can pull out the chalk again and be like, all right, and let's do it once more. So it's really, really helpful for kind of like low-key sort of like in the closet magic too, which is really nice for a lot of people. Obviously, like, we have a lot of people at Circle Sanctuary that are out, but I do know a couple of people that have come to festivals over the years that aren't particularly open about being pagan, and chalk is a really good way to make sure that you're not going to get caught in the act or whatever. And it's also really nice for when you're living in temporary housing, like an apartment, a college dorm, a house that you might one day want to sell, to be able to just like not have to worry about wiping ink or trying to figure out how to get rid of a carving that you've put above a door. So the chalk again, to me, is one of the most important components. These are all, however, base components for a spell. And the biggest thing about Romani magic is that spells, again, magic is changing. It's an evolving practice. Everybody does things different. So this is when your own personal part of this starts coming in. And so you can put, we're going to do the base components today on your end, at least, unless you want to like run around really, really quick and grab something that's really, really close to you. But for the base components of the spell, like, this is what you need to make the spell work. Now, if you want to add something more to it, that is sort of like gives it your own like personal flair, that is entirely okay as well. So like my dad, for example, will put, like, when he's done this before, I've seen him put different things in it. At one time he put in a drop of shoe shine and did that around the doorway. And obviously the water was enough to dilute it, so it wasn't like there was like a ton of shoe shine suddenly like around the door to our laundry room, because otherwise my mother would have gotten really, really mad. But he wanted to do that because he wanted, in this time when he was doing this spell, right before people were coming to our house, he wanted us to appear presentable. And there is nothing to him that makes a person appear more presentable than having well-shined shoes. Which sounds really weird, but that's my dad. So for me, I put, when I'm doing this, I put nails in it. And nails doesn't necessarily equate to bane work, so don't worry too much about that. But I like to have sort of a sharper sort of sense of magic, a sort of sharper like protection. I am a, to people that don't know me very well, to strangers, I can be a very aloof, sort of prickly person, and I have a persona like that on purpose, so I don't have to worry too much about myself. Oh no, I just dropped one. I'll get that in a minute. I like to have that sort of persona about myself, sort of that air of prickliness, of that sharpness about myself, in order to keep myself protected. And so sometimes, you know, like I've seen people use like mugwort, lavender is another really good one if you want to kind of have like a sort of like calm, sort of like almost zen-like protection to you. So these are sort of the components that we're going to be working with. So now that all of this is laid out, let's get to the actual doorway spell. All right, everybody, so now we've got our doorway. This is the doorway to my bedroom. As you can see, there is a door jamb here. So we've got our doorway, our water, our salt, our hard-soled shoes. Wait, that's the wrong chant. We've got our water, our salt, our rag, our chalk, and then if you have anything that you want to add to it, I have put my nails in my pocket. So kind of just like stick them somewhere on your person that you're not going to forget them. Okay, so you take your water. You just want to put it kind of on the floor in front of where you're working. You don't want to stick it in the doorway with you, because that's going to be a lot of work trying to get around it. And you're also going to want to keep the floor here around your door clear, because you're going to be doing stuff with all four sides of your door. So then you take your salt and you just add in whatever amount feels right. I have like some really fine like natural sea salt here, but it has a tendency to clump. So I'm just adding it in. Come on. And I won't use all of it because that'll make my roommates mad, but enough that it makes the water cloudy. So then you've got your salt, and then you're just going to take whatever you have. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's one still floating around in there somewhere, and I'd like for it to not stab me later. There it is. I have 7 nails here, so I'm just going to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And you're probably going to ask me, Hollis, what should I do with these things that I'm putting in here after the ritual is over? And I'm going to show you after the ritual is over. But I will say, before you start dropping anything in, don't put anything in that is super duper important. So like, don't put in your grandmother's locket. That would be a bad idea. So just like things that you wouldn't mind getting rid of. So then you take your rag and you're going to stick it in the bucket. I have really cold water. So, you know, like don't use like boiling water for this unless you really feel like going to the hospital later. So you're just going to stir and kind of like stir in the salt, stir in whatever you've got. You're going to stir clockwise because that's always a good direction to stir things. That's not something that I picked up from Romani Magic. That's just something that I do regularly. So if you wanted to stir widdershins, I guess you could, but for this practice, I don't see the point of that. You're going to take your rag. There's going to be a lot of excess water dripping from it, and you're just going to like wring that out so that way you aren't like totally dripping. And then you're going to start from your dominant hand, mine is my left, and you're going to go to the top corner of wherever your doorway is. So if you were right-handed, you'd be up here. And you're going to start swiping clockwise. Again, not particularly important in Romani magic, but it is important in at least my magical practice, so that's what I do. And then you swipe clockwise around the area of your door. And if you haven't cleaned your door in a long time, now's going to be the time that you find that out. And you're going to just go around the edge of your door. And while you're doing this, you're going to think of the intention. You're going to think of what is in the room that you are protecting. And sometimes you might have to like sort of change your position of your hand on your rag, but you always want to keep it your dominant hand. So kind of just swipe up and go around. Once you get back to where you started in a corner, that's your first round done. So you're still, again, like thinking of things that you want to protect in your room or in the place where you are protecting. The things you want to protect, maybe the people you want to protect too. And then you go and you're stirring your rag in your pot again. This is also the time when you find out if you've cut your hand recently, because the salt is really going to sting. And then you wring it out again. And this time, you're going to go from the corner that you started at. So again, if you're right-handed, you started in this corner, you're going to go to the next corner over. So if you're left-handed like me, it means you start in the top right corner. If you are right-handed, you're going to go down to the floor. And then you just hit it. And then you start swiping around your doorway again. And again, you're thinking of things that you are protecting. So like for me, this is where I sleep. And so I like to think about all of the things, I would like to think about good dreams. Things don't always have to be material. So you have once again reached the corner that you started at. So then you take your rag and you put it back in the mix and you stir it around again. Take that, wring it out. And again, if you're adding things into this, like herbs, you know, like again, I do nails. This is a good time once you've reached your third corner. So if you're right-handed, you'll be down on the opposite side of the floor. I'm left-handed, so I have reached this corner. I've just reached the floor. Now you're going to go around, and let's say if your magical practice involves singing, you can do some singing around this point. You can do some chanting. I bet Selena would have a really great chant for this. I'm not much of a chanter myself, so that's not something that I really do. Sometimes if I'm feeling it, I might hum a tune of some sort, but today's not really that day, so I'm just kind of doing like education while I do this because that's something that I enjoy. So you're back down to your corner again. So stand back up, put your stuff back in the bucket and stir it around again. And if you listen really closely, you can hear the nails swirling around in the bottom of this metal pot that I have. And so now you're at your fourth corner. So I am down here on the floor. If you are right-handed, you're at the corner where I started. So you'll go down to wherever you're at or up to wherever you're at. And once again, we're going to go around the doorway. This is also a really good practice for, again, people who are not out because it just looks like you're cleaning. So, all right, we've hit that fourth corner again. Or you've hit that third corner basically by this point because it's 1, 2, 3, 4. But then the thing is that usually when we'd be doing this 3 times. So it's to make sure that you're getting every possible surface, that you are doing every possible corner. But for the sake of time and brevity, we're only going to do this once. But the thing is that you always do 5 corners. So you're going to want to do the first corner twice. So you're back up to where you started. And again, if you're right-handed, you'll be back up here. If you're left-handed like me, you started here. So the corner that you started on, you do a second time. And that's basically just to make sure that you've covered all your bases. So if you were doing this 3 times, and again, we're not going to because at that point, 1, it would get repetitive, and 2, time-wise, just not a good idea. You would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 5. And basically you do it 3 times, but at the very end, you would just do the last corner for 1 final time. So it would actually be, at that point, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So, all right. So we have gotten this done. And instead of doing it 3 times, we only do it the once. So then the rag just goes back in the bucket. And you just kind of leave it there for now because you're not going to need it anymore. But you still kind of want it to be imbued with stuff later once you're done. You're going to take your salt and you're going to take your whatever. And now, I bet you're wondering, but Hollis, where does the chalk come in? And the answer is the chalk comes in now. So you get your chalk, and now that you have successfully done stuff to your door, this is going to be the fun part. So if you have a door that actually shuts, you might want to put your chalk stuff on the door itself. And you can maybe, if you really, really wanted to, you could get a ladder and you could do the top part of the door and the side of the door. Obviously, you wouldn't be able to do anything to the bottom. My grandmother used to do this to her front door, but she did this regularly and all of the chalk would come off from all of the door opening and closing. I'm assuming that if you are in the middle of your house and you're not at your front door doing this, you probably would not have a door here, or you might not have a door here. And so for the sake of everybody's sanity, we're not going to do the part with the actual door. But know that you can, if you really wanted to, just go along the edge of your door and do this. But instead, whatever side you want to do it on, it doesn't really matter. But for me, since I'm living in a house and I'm living with roommates and I don't really want people to see, again, if you don't want outsiders to see kind of what you're doing, you would do it on the side of the door that's not public facing. So if it was a Vardo, for example, it would be around the edge of the door that's not public facing. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your chalk and you're going to just draw a line that's a zigzag line, and it's a bunch of triangles. And this is so, the edges, from my understanding when my grandmother was teaching me, it's because the edges are jagged and all of the bad things catch on the jagged edges. And I'm just, it sounds like a saw a little bit when you're doing this. And then you get up to the top and you just keep making that sort of edge around the door. I am very short, so I have to stand on my tiptoes to get to the top. And then we come around the other edge of the door, still doing the saw jag here. And there will be some places you'll kind of see here. Also, you don't have to do a continuous line. So if you break it, don't worry, you don't have to start over. You'll kind of see that in some places, and I'll bring up the camera to show around the edge before. But you'll notice with your chalk that some places have a fainter line than others, and sometimes like there are even places where the chalk don't show up. It doesn't matter if the chalk doesn't show up, it just matters that the chalk went over it. It doesn't have to be a continuous line. So then, like if your chalk kind of like falters on you at one point and doesn't quite want to go, that's okay. The biggest thing is that if it's faltering on you for a long time, you might want to like move the chalk in your hand to get a better line, so that way you can still at least see where you did it. So coming down the edge of the doorway, and we get to the bottom, and now there's this really, I wouldn't say nice, but you know, there's this very obvious line of zigzags around your door. And you're not going to put anything on the floor because that's going to get tracked away pretty easily. But the next thing is that, okay, so we did this around the door. And as you notice, I didn't say it at the very beginning, but I did it clockwise. So you can do it clockwise too, or again, you can do it widdershins, like whatever you want to do. But then after the zigzag line, you're going to start again down at the bottom left corner, since it's clockwise, and you're just going to draw another line straight up. Just whoop, through the middle of the zigzag line. So there's a line. You pick your chalk up, and then you do another line. And you go across the top, and you pick your chalk up, and then you go down around the edges. And the straight line is for like all of the good things to come in. So it's, if you leave it's just the jagged line, then like everything's gonna get caught. But it's the idea that all of the good things are going to come in, because not everything's going to get caught, because you're seeing some parts of the jagged line are getting cut off by the straight line. So that's kind of where that is. So this is kind of the design that you're going to have. And again, I'll bring the camera closer and I'll show you kind of a close-up shot of it here in a second. But you're going to have just a zigzag line with a straight line running through it. And then this is the part, again, if you're really into runes, if you're really into sigils, if you're really into that sort of thing, you kind of want to put it here on the door. And I don't really have like any particular practice that means that I really enjoy sigils, like I don't really do runes, anything like that. So I'm going to leave this as it is. And over time, and the best part is, over time, if I want to change anything, if I decide that I want to redo the spell, which I probably will later. Actually, I will later because I'm going to show you. All I have to do is just wipe off the line. And sometimes, like I'll only wipe one side off so that way again you can see later. Sometimes like not all of the chalk will go away, but it's as easy as washing it off with a rag or a clean, or just like water or something like that. So now you have your chalk line. Now here's the fun part. That's when you bring the water back, because, oh, you thought you were done with it? No. Silly. You're going to take your water and again, stir the rag around in it. And we're going to do the 5 corners again. And again, if we were doing this as a full-on spell, this would be another 3 times plus the 5th. So start up at your proper corner. Again, if you're right-handed, you're going to be up here. And you're going to swipe around the doorway again. And I'm going to do this much faster than I did before because I'm assuming that you all got it the first time. And so, like, also to kind of show you, if I'm not talking and explaining through it, how quickly this can be done. Because my grandma, when she did this, used to be able to do this wicked fast. It was almost impressive. And again, she's doing it like 3 times. So it would be really fun to watch her do this. And you would hear her old granny bones creaking when she would just be bending her knees all the time to get to the bottom doorway. And again, this is a really good way to figure out if you have washed your doorway recently. And then again, I just did the bottom left corner, but we make sure to do all 5. So then we're back up here again, and we swipe around, and then back up. And that's how you do a Cinti Manouche Romani doorway. So this is a closer look, since I reviewed the last video and realized that you can't really see it from afar. This is a closer look of kind of how my zigzaggy and straight lines look. And again, does not have to be perfect. It just matters that it was once there. So then you have all of that all the way around your door. And then this is what it looks like kind of when you just like erase it with your hand. And again, like some parts of it will linger behind, but you can wipe those away with a rag and it won't stay. It's chalk. You've been to school. You know what it's like. So you don't really have to worry too much about it sticking around, not like ink or like carving would. So just to let you see kind of what that looks like. Also, I almost forgot. This is what you're going to do with the water that's left over. So basically every Romani camp kind of had an edge of camp area where they would take things. This is my house. So I just took it down to the curb here and I'm going to fish out the rag because I would like to keep that. Because again, you can use it to like imbue protective qualities, but you kind of just want to squeeze it out and kind of like get the water out of it. And I'm going to sit it on my shoe so that way it doesn't get too bad. And then basically you're going to take everything in it, including whatever you put in it, and you're just going to dump it out. And I have like those 7 nails that I put in it, and they're just kind of sitting there. You're just going to leave them, at least for a little while. If they're like really bad for the environment, like those nails for example, I probably don't want to leave them for a very long time. Leave them kind of overnight, and then you should have the ability to come back and pick them up later, but you are going to throw them away.